noticing the quieter, more subtle voice that actually does have a preference or an opinion, but oftentimes because it's not as loud as the commanding, demanding task manager's voice, it gets swept to the side. And to be able to notice the voice is already a deepening of awareness. But to be able to follow through with respecting it and showing that respect by following it up with action. Like, yeah, this might be inconvenient in the moment to do this, but this actually is what you want. So let's do it. Let's make it happen. Is an act of self-love, is an act of care, of validation, of being of service to our most deepest and subtlest yearnings. And it shows up in small ways that we can be of offering. And the more we're able to hear and attend that subtler voice of what's really wanted in the moment, and to be able to offer it, the more trust that voice can have in expressing more frequently what it wants. Because it wants to be heard, and the pain of being dismissed will often lead it to speaking softer and softer. Nobody likes rejection. Nobody likes to feel like they don't matter, even our own internal parts. And that is the great healing, that when we can offer that for ourselves, we don't need it so much from others. And there's a possibility of freedom, because if I'm not needing people to behave in a particular way for me to meet my deepest needs, if I'm able to show interest, self-empathy, attention, care towards myself, I still get that need met. And the more validation it receives, the more it will speak. And that voice becomes the guide. That voice is your teacher. If you follow that voice, it will take you where you want to go. Because it's the aspect of you that knows, that wants to be heard. And in its fullness, I oftentimes think of this somewhat of a parent-child relationship, that when we give our full attention to the small child and we validate what it wants, there's this building of confidence, boldness that might start to arise to take more and more risks, because it's being supported. It's not alone. And oftentimes what keeps us from taking risks or trying something different is this feeling, this overwhelming feeling that whatever we choose to do, there's this huge weight that it's all on us and we have to deal with it alone. And just the sense that we're being accompanied takes some of that pressure off. I mean, on an ultimate sense, what we're doing is we're starting to cultivate a relationship with ourselves to repair the trust that's been broken. And when that trust is recovered, when we reestablish the channel to our inner knowing self and the trust is repaired, we actually will have access to more information. A big part of the work that we're doing is healing that relationship that we were taught since we were young, that however we were doing things was not the right way. There's this other way that we should be, this other way we should do things. And that has caused a break in our confidence and our trust in knowing how to do things. And you can see this in children, that the way they come into the world is often through pure experimentation. Just trying things over and over, trying it in a different way, very engaged, very intrigued. And what happens, innocently, but what happens is that they start being pulled away, or they have to follow a certain rhythm that maybe is not their own, or they have to behave in a particular way that is going to be more acceptable for us to live in a larger group. And so that's where the doubt starts coming in, where there's that impulse to do something. And we're also taught to control our impulses. Don't be so impulsive. And it's a natural thing of being social creatures and living in large groups, but it comes at the cost. And that cost is a break in the relationship that we have to our own inner knowing. We're taught that we need to externalize our understanding of things. We either have to be affirmed by some authoritative figure, or it needs to be supported by existing knowledge that's out there. And so there's this inherent distrust that whatever's coming up for me needs to be verified using an external source as a reference. And the danger in that is that external source as a reference doesn't work for the unique configurations of our personality structure. And so we're caught in this feeling of inadequacy where we either have to submit and self-sacrifice or accommodate to be accepted in exchange for acceptance, belonging, love, or we have to defend ourselves. And we have our own defense strategies. So that often shows up in rebellion or shows up in other protective strategies so that we can keep the integrity of what's left in there. And that causes oftentimes disconnection with the larger collective, and it's very threatening. And so it becomes very confusing. It's like, what do I choose here? Do I choose to listen and follow what's happening inside of me at the cost of potentially losing connection to the larger collective whole? Or do I self-sacrifice and accommodate and lose that internal connection with myself? Kind of like being stuck between a rock and a hard place. And so it's natural to feel confused about that and not really know how to go about it, and to feel stuck in a state of helplessness. But as we start realizing the unreliability of the collective, there is this turning back inwards. And I almost feel like that's our cycle, our human cycle, right? We start as children and we move away and we go out into the world. And then in adulthood, we start realizing certain things are not necessarily clicking, or There's just this pervasive sense of dissatisfaction. So we try another way, we come back inside. It's almost like a natural progression of our spiritual journey in this human realm. And part of this self-repair is really not taking my word for it, but really noticing the impact of following a choice that comes from our inner knowing. And again, that impact will be felt in the body. It just feels like, I call it being in alignment, that our actions are actually matching what's wanted inside. And there's just a clicking, and there's just a sense of harmony reestablishing, and a clarity and a vividness and a sense of access. And when that channel is reestablished, that I know that if I just go inwards and I listen carefully, I will know whatever it is that I need to know to navigate any external situation. There's a deep sense of safety. And this self-trust and this access to an inner knowing and this feeling of safety is like a homecoming. It's like a balm that soothes all of the confusion, all of the pain, all of the disconnect that I've felt up until this point. I really strongly believe that our way is at the foundational level, starting with regaining that access to ourselves. Because as mentioned before, who's going to know better than you what it is that you need and what's your way? And it doesn't mean we're not open to hearing other people. And this includes also teachers. You know, I had a meeting with my teacher who I deeply respect. And as I was listening to what he was saying, some things were landing and other things were not. And there was no hard feeling about that whatsoever. Because on an ultimate sense, what we're all doing is projecting our reality or how we're perceiving things onto another. It doesn't mean that that's what the other is experiencing. There's no way that I have access to all the information of what you're experiencing inside. So who am I to be able to tell you what's going on? But I can let you know what's coming up for me as I'm in your presence, and as you're sharing, I can reflect the impact on me. And then internally, what you can do is assess, does that resonate or does that not resonate? And sometimes that reflection will expose something that was a blind spot or that you might have not had access yourself. And sometimes it'll be way off base. And physically, you'll know the difference. And if we think about it in that way, every single person in our lives is a teacher. Because we don't have the ability to see the entirety of ourselves. And it's in the relationships that we're in particular, if there's friction, because the friction is usually coming from something being exposed that we don't like. And we know when we've actually exposed something because now all of a sudden there's a defensiveness and there's a positionality. I was like, oh, what are you talking about? That's not who I am. No, you're getting this all wrong. If we're confident about who I am, what does it matter what somebody else thinks? And it's like, oh, yeah, that's their perception based on what I showed. Fair enough. or based on what their own personal experiences have been and their biases, that's their perception of what's going on. It's nothing to me because I know what's true and what's real for me in that given moment. And if I'm in any way defending myself or feeling tight around what somebody is perceiving or projecting onto me, that tells me there's still something for me to inquire about. If there's any positionality whatsoever, that means I'm still holding on to some aspect of story that's probably not true. And again, it's useful. Conflict is very useful. Because if everything was harmonious and we would just be complacent, everything's fine, there's nothing to examine. But it's when there is a conflict that all of a sudden our idea, our delusion that things are in a particular way is broken. And we have an opportunity for true seeing. And that truly that other person that we're in conflict with is a gift, is a teacher to show us something that we wouldn't be able to see on our own. And so this brings up equanimity, because equanimity can be used as a reference point as to how close we are to the truth. Because equanimity is the lack of positionality, meaning that it doesn't matter how I'm being perceived, or it doesn't matter what's happening around me. It just is. There's not a story around that. There's not a right or a wrong. There's not a this should be happening and this should not be happening. It's just observation. It's just objective. It's not detached. It's just not attached. We're not attached to any particular outcome. We're just noticing the coming and going. And so that could be a nice baseline to use as a reference point. That if I'm in a place of equanimity, most likely I'm in a place of wisdom and true seeing, because I'm not being distracted, nor is my view becoming narrow because I'm fixated on a particular outcome or positionality. Again, this is tricky because I'm not saying that we're okay with everything that's going on. I'm not okay with the transgression of boundaries, nor will I allow that to happen. But I'm not over-identified with what's happening. I can see that that is not necessarily something that is meant directly as a personal attack to me. I can see, oh, that person just doesn't know. We're just all bumbling around trying to figure our ways. And sometimes we're going to knock into each other. Doesn't mean necessarily that there is like a malice or an intentionality or a story or whatever. Or it could mean that, and we see it clearly. And we're not needing to build or justify a case around our belief system. You just see it clearly. It's like, oh, yeah, that was malicious. Okay. So now I know. And now I'm not going to be in this situation anymore. So the amazing thing is we actually have everything inside of us built in to be able to navigate anything. Anything. And what we have is we have awareness to notice what's happening. We have a body so that we can respond in action. And then there's awareness again to notice the impact. And this awareness of noticing impact is really an awareness of noticing what's the biofeedback? Meaning, what's the physical, emotional, mental state that arises as a result of this experience? So even though we talk about like what's happening in the body or what's happening in the emotion or what's happening in the mind, actually, it's neither of that. It's all of those things combined generate a state. And that state is the result of physical, emotional, mental processes that work together. And there's a felt quality of a state. You can feel it now. Even if it's subtle, there's a state. And developing acuity in sensing this state is what we can use as our compass. That when the resulting state is that of equanimity, we're onto something. And if the resulting state is something outside of equanimity, we're also onto something. It doesn't matter which of the two that arises, as long as we're able to be aware of what's arising in relationship to the experience we're having. It all comes down to how we relate to what we're experiencing. It's not the experience itself, it's how do we relate. And so how we're relating to what's happening is where the freedom is. Because oftentimes we can't really change the experience itself, even though notice that that's the strategy we use, right? We're like constantly trying to contrive an experience. That's where we put all our attention, to make the experience better or different in some kind of way, which is ridiculous, right? It's a waste of time. We can't make that happen. But it's really about how we relate to the experience. That's the key. And that's where there's choice. That's where there's freedom.